My wife cheated, but what happened when I got revenge? You won't believe it. Jake stood by the kitchen window, holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Outside, a light rain was falling, and the glow of streetlights reflected off puddles, creating an eerie atmosphere. The TV in the living room played the evening news on mute, but Jake wasn't watching. His mind was consumed by the events that had unraveled in his life lately. Emily, his wife, seemed the same as always, smiling, attentive, and seemingly caring. But something had changed, and Jake could feel it in his gut. Her habits, once ordinary, now filled him with suspicion. For example, Emily had never been overly concerned with privacy before. Her phone would often lie around on the table or couch, and she wouldn't flinch if it rang or buzzed. But now, her phone was always with her. She kept it close, even when leaving the room for just a moment. Jake first noticed this about a week ago. He had walked into their bedroom, and Emily quickly placed her phone face down on the nightstand. She smiled and said, "Oh, it's just a message from Jess. She's asking for some advice about work." Jake nodded, pretending to believe her, but there was something in her tone that didn't sit right with him. With each passing day, his suspicions grew. One evening, as they were having dinner together, Emily received a message and suddenly said, "Oh, sorry, I need to respond to this. It's about the volunteer project." Jake watched her face closely. She smiled, but her eyes avoided his. That night, he barely slept. His mind raced with questions. Could Emily be hiding something? And if so, what? A few days later, Jake decided to come home early from work. As he opened the door, he heard soft laughter coming from the living room. Walking closer, he saw Emily on a video call on her laptop. The moment she saw him, she quickly shut the lid. "Oh, you're home already? I thought you'd be back later," she said with a strained smile. "Who was that?" Jake asked, trying to sound calm. "Just a project discussion. Nothing important," she replied, once again avoiding his gaze. That was the turning point. That night, after Emily had fallen asleep, Jake took her phone from the nightstand. His hands trembled, and his heart pounded so loudly he was sure it would wake her. The password was the same as always. Opening her messaging app, he saw a name he didn't recognize. And then, he read their conversation. "You were breathtaking today. I can still smell your scent on my skin." Jake froze. His breathing became shallow, and he gripped the phone so tightly it seemed on the verge of breaking. Emily, his Emily, whom he had loved for years, was writing such things to another man? He read one message after another, each word cutting into him like a blade. Their conversations were filled with romance, laughter, and even plans for the future. Jake placed the phone back and went into the bathroom. Staring at himself in the mirror, he tried to process what he had just discovered. Anger, betrayal, and heartbreak swirled inside him. One question echoed in his mind: why? Why would she do this? In the following days, Jake acted as though nothing had happened. But inside, he was already formulating a plan. That evening, when he met his old friend Logan at a bar, he finally shared his suspicions. "You know, Jake," Logan said, sipping his beer, "if she cheated on you, you've got to teach her a lesson." "What do you mean?" Jake asked. "Revenge. But not just some petty revenge. You've got to do it in a way that makes her realize what she lost." Those words stuck in Jake's mind. He didn't want to act impulsively, but he knew he couldn't just forgive Emily. One thing was certain: what happened next would change their lives forever. Jake had always believed his marriage to Emily was rock solid. They had met at a college party 10 years ago and had been inseparable ever since. Jake admired her sharp mind and unyielding optimism, while Emily was drawn to his reliability and ability to brighten even her darkest days. But something in their relationship had started to shift. It began with small things. Emily, once carefree and open, now avoided direct conversations. Her phone became a permanent extension of her hand, accompanying her even to the bathroom or kitchen. More than once, Jake caught her quickly turning off her screen when he entered the room. Her behavior raised more and more red flags. As he opened the door, he heard muffled laughter coming from the living room. Walking closer, he saw Emily talking on a video call on her laptop. On the screen was a man with a confident expression. Jake didn't recognize him, but his heart began to race. "Oh, you're home already?" Emily quickly closed the laptop. "It was just a work call. I didn't even notice how the time flew by." Jake sensed something was off. Her tone was too casual, her smile too strained. But he stayed silent. The next morning, while Emily was in the shower, Jake worked up the courage to take her phone. The password was familiar. He even felt guilty for knowing it. Opening the Messenger app, he found a conversation that made his heart clench. A man named Michael had written messages to Emily about how much he missed her and wanted to see her again. "You were incredible. I can still feel your touch," Michael wrote. Emily's replies were equally passionate, filled with plans for their next meeting. Jake froze, the phone trembling in his hands. Hundreds of questions swirled in his mind. How long had this been going on? Why did she do it? Was Michael worth destroying their marriage? He put the phone back and decided not to confront her. Yet, this time, he decided to act. Over the next week, Jake began observing Emily's behavior closely. He noticed when she left the house, how she dressed, and who she interacted with. Each detail only deepened his suspicions. One evening, Emily told him she was meeting her friends. Jake decided to check. Taking his car, he discreetly followed her. She didn't go to the cafe she mentioned, but stopped at a small restaurant on the outskirts of town. A few minutes later, Michael arrived at her table. Their laughter and the way they looked at each other left no doubt. Jake sat in his car, his blood boiling. He wanted to storm in and ruin their moment, but something held him back. He realized this wasn't the time to act on emotions. Revenge had to be calculated. Returning home, Jake began crafting a plan. His anger was palpable, but so was a cold determination to take back control of the situation. He resolved that his revenge wouldn't be a mere act of rage, but a meticulously executed blow. First, he needed to learn everything about Michael. Jake turned to his friend Logan, a private investigator. Logan promised to uncover everything about the man, his marital status, work, and vulnerabilities. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Logan asked as they sat in a bar. "I've never been more certain," Jake replied, sipping his whiskey. While Logan carried out his investigation, Jake began collecting evidence. He saved all of Emily's messages, made copies, and even recorded her phone calls. Every detail was a piece of his plan for perfect revenge. But one night, as Jake reviewed the recordings, he stumbled upon something unexpected. Michael was hiding something from Emily as well. "I need to tell you something important," Michael wrote in one message. "But not now. It could change everything." Jake paused. What could Michael be hiding? And how could he use it to his advantage? Sitting in his car a few blocks away from home, Jake stared at a printed report, a list of Emily's calls and messages. It was undeniable proof that she had been keeping something significant from him. It had all started weeks ago, when Jake noticed subtle changes in Emily's behavior. Her phone had become an extension of her hand. She carried it everywhere, even to family dinners or quick trips to the bathroom. Once, when Jake walked into their bedroom, she nervously turned off the screen and slipped the phone into her pocket. "What are you up to?" Jake asked, trying to sound casual. "Oh, nothing. Just looking at recipes," she replied a little too quickly. It was a small thing, but it raised his suspicions. Over the following days, his doubts only grew. Emily often left the house under the guise of meeting friends, dressed better than usual. Her smiles felt forced, and their conversations had become shallow. The home, once filled with laughter and closeness, now had an invisible wall between them. One evening, after Emily had fallen asleep, Jake took her phone. His heart pounded so loudly he was afraid it might wake her. Opening her Messenger app, he found her conversation with Michael. The messages were full of confessions, jokes, and intimate details that left no room for doubt. "I can still feel you, your touch, your scent," Michael wrote in his last message. Jake froze. His world turned upside down. He closed the phone and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process what he had just seen. All their years together, their plans, their dreams, it all felt like a lie now. The next day, Jake didn't say a word, but he decided to act. Jake wasn't the kind of man who tolerated betrayal. He wasn't going to cause a scene, throw a tantrum, or cry into his pillow. No, he wanted the truth, and to decide how to move forward with it. Over the next week, Jake gathered evidence. He saved screenshots, recorded phone conversations, and even followed Emily when she claimed she was meeting with friends. Everything fell into place one evening when he saw her walk into a small restaurant on the outskirts of town. Minutes later, Michael, the same man from her messages, joined her table. They talked, laughed, and exchanged looks that only lovers could share. Jake watched them from his car. He didn't storm into the restaurant as much as he wanted to. Instead, he drove home, consumed with a cold anger. He knew this was only the beginning. At home, Jake started researching who Michael was. With help from his friend Logan, a private investigator, Jake learned that Michael was a successful businessman, but his reputation was less than stellar. He'd had multiple affairs with married women, none of which ended well. One evening, when Emily returned home late, she found Jake sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Just working," he replied without even looking up. She nodded, but her unease was obvious. Emily could sense that Jake was changing, but she couldn't grasp just how close he was to uncovering everything. Later that night, while Emily was asleep, Jake received a message from Logan. It was a set of photos showing Michael with another woman. They didn't look like just a fling. In the pictures, they appeared to be a long-term couple. Jake smiled to himself. He knew how to use this information. But before making a move, he wanted more. He wanted Emily to understand that her betrayal wasn't just a mistake, but something that would have consequences she couldn't imagine. Meanwhile, Emily began to suspect that Jake knew something. Her anxiety grew, making her more cautious, which only fueled Jake's suspicions. That night, when Emily left the house under the pretense of meeting with friends, Jake decided to follow her. This time, he wouldn't just observe. What he saw that night changed his plans. Emily wasn't meeting Michael. She was with another man Jake had never seen before. Their conversation looked tense, and Emily's expression was one of fear. They were arguing, and Jake decided to stay hidden to figure out what was happening. Jake sat in his car, watching Emily and the man through tinted windows. She stood with her arms crossed, while the man gestured animatedly. Jake leaned closer to the window, trying to catch more details. Who was this man? Why was she with him? Jake thought he knew everything about his wife, but this scene proved otherwise. He started recording audio on his phone, hoping to catch fragments of their conversation. The wind carried only snippets. "You promised," the man said, his voice irritated. "That was a long time ago," Emily replied, her voice shaky but quiet. "Long ago or not, you knew this would come back," the man said, clenching his fist. "We had an agreement." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. What agreement? What had Emily kept from him? The man abruptly turned, glanced both ways, and walked off quickly. Emily stood still for a few moments, seemingly torn, before pulling out her phone. She dialed a number but didn't put it to her ear. Instead, she canceled the call and walked in the opposite direction. Jake waited until she disappeared around the corner, then decided to follow the mysterious man. His gut told him that the answers to his questions lay with him. Keeping a safe distance, Jake followed the man until he entered the lobby of an old office building. Jake quickly snapped a photo of the sign at the entrance, Brown and Associates Law Firm. He didn't recognize the name, but something told him this lead was worth pursuing. The next morning, Jake met Logan again. Logan, ever the professional, had already gathered extensive information about Michael, but this time, Jake asked him to focus on the mysterious man instead. "He's a lawyer, and that gives me a bad feeling," Jake said, handing Logan the photo of the sign. "All right," Logan replied. "I'll find out everything. But are you sure you want to know everything about her?" "I have to, Logan. She lied to me, and now I need to understand who she really is." 2 days later, Logan brought back the results. The man's name was Nick Gray. He wasn't just a lawyer. He had handled criminal cases in the past and often found himself at the center of high-profile scandals. But what shocked Jake the most was one detail. Years ago, Nick had been involved in a case that featured Emily. It was a civil case tied to some business dealings, Logan explained, handing Jake a stack of documents. "But from what I can tell, Nick lost big. Maybe he still holds a grudge against her." Jake studied the documents for hours. The case was convoluted, But between the lines, it was clear that Emily hadn't played fair. She had used legal loopholes to secure a massive profit, damaging Nick's reputation in the process. Jake was beginning to realize that his wife wasn't as innocent as she appeared. That evening, when Emily returned home, Jake tried to act normal. She looked tired, but there was a tension in her eyes that betrayed her. "How was your day?" he asked casually. "Fine, just normal." "What about yours?" she replied without meeting his gaze. "You know, I saw something interesting on the news, a law firm called Brown and Associates." "Ever heard of it?" he asked, as though offhandedly. Emily froze for a split second. She quickly turned to him and said, "No, never heard of it. Why do you ask?" "Oh, I just stumbled upon it. Thought maybe you knew." She smiled, but it was forced. Jake could feel she was hiding something, but he didn't press her. He knew he had to wait for the right moment. That night, as Emily slept, Jake reviewed all the materials Logan had given him. One detail stood out. The name of a company involved in the case was now one of Michael's main clients. This couldn't be a coincidence. Emily, Nick, and Michael were more connected than he had imagined. The next day, Jake decided to act. He went to Nick Gray's office, posing as a potential client. In a room filled with the scent of leather and old books, Nick greeted him with a slight air of curiosity. "What can I do for you?" Nick asked, studying Jake carefully. "I'm interested in a case involving a woman. Her name is Emily." "I think you know her," Jake said, locking eyes with him. Nick's reaction was immediate. He tensed but tried to maintain his composure. "What exactly are you looking to know?" Nick asked. "I want to know what she did. Why are you meeting her late at night? And why does it seem like she owes you something?" Nick smirked faintly, a smile that promised nothing good. "You probably don't know everything about your wife, mister?" "Jake." "Just Jake," he cut in. "Well, Jake," Nick said, leaning forward, "sometimes people have secrets best left buried. My advice, don't dig where you don't need to." Jake felt anger rising inside him. He knew Nick was holding back, but this had now become personal. He returned home with more questions than answers. Emily was already asleep, and Jake decided he wouldn't wait any longer. He had a plan, but before taking action, he wanted to check one last thing: her email. Opening her account, Jake found emails that confirmed his worst fears. But one email, in particular, made him hold his breath. The sender was Nick Gray. The subject line contained only one word: reckoning. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone. Her fingers nervously scrolled through her news feed, but her mind was far from the screen. She felt it. Jake suspected something. His glances were too sharp, his conversations too strained. The anxiety she had tried to ignore was now impossible to deny. "He knows," she thought, and the realization made her heart race. Tossing the phone aside, Emily stood and began pacing the room. She needed to act while she still had the chance. Delaying any longer would be dangerous. Her past was catching up with her, and now not just Nick, but also Jake was becoming part of this game. She realized that ignoring the problem was no longer an option. At the same time, Jake sat in his office, reviewing the new evidence he had gathered over the past few days. His suspicions about Emily's connections with Nick were being confirmed. He was only a few steps away from fully exposing her. What Jake didn't know was that Emily was already crafting her own plan. Later that evening, as they had dinner, Emily unexpectedly spoke up. "Jake, I think we need to talk," she said, trying to sound calm. He looked up from his plate and stared at her. His gaze held no warmth, only a cold curiosity. "About what?" he asked, feigning ignorance. "Recently, I feel like you've been distant. It's like there's a wall between us, and I want to fix it," she said softly, though tension sparkled in her eyes. Jake said nothing. He simply watched her intently, giving her the space to continue. Emily exhaled dramatically, playing her part. She knew she had to tread carefully. One wrong move now would only confirm his suspicions. "I want us to be honest with each other. If something's bothering you, please tell me," she added, her voice laced with an attempt at sincerity. Jake leaned forward slightly. "Honest? All right. Then tell me, who is Nick Gray, and why did you meet with him last week?" His words cut like a knife. Emily froze for a moment. She had anticipated that Jake might know something, but she hadn't expected him to uncover this so quickly. She needed to think fast. "It's not what you think," she began. "Nick is part of an old story. This was before you. I had some financial problems, and he was helping me deal with them. And you think I'll believe that?" Jake leaned back in his chair. "You've lied to me again, and it's obvious." Emily realized her words weren't working. She couldn't rely on simple excuses anymore. It was time to act. That night, while Jake slept, Emily gathered her notes, contacts, and compromising documents from a hidden stash. She knew she had to protect herself before Jake used this against her. Her plan was simple: make it look like Jake was the one crossing the line. The next day, Emily called Michael. Her voice was calm but firm. "We need to meet. I can't wait any longer." Michael agreed, though his tone betrayed his unease. They arranged to meet that evening at an upscale bar. Emily knew it was risky, but she had no other choice. During the meeting, she laid it all out for him. About Nick, about Jake, and about her crumbling marriage. "If Jake finds out everything about us, it won't just ruin me. It'll ruin you too," she said, gripping her wine glass tightly. "And what do you suggest?" Michael asked, his tension evident. "We need to make him back off. We need to find a way to make him look like he's the one in the wrong," she said, her voice cold and calculating. Michael nodded, though doubt flickered in his eyes. He didn't trust Emily completely, but he knew they had no other choice. Meanwhile, Jake wasn't wasting time. He tracked Emily's every move using GPS on her phone. That night, when she met with Michael, he recorded their conversation using a hidden microphone in her bag. Jake was prepared for anything, but what he heard forced him to rethink his plan. Emily was manipulating Michael, pushing him to turn against Jake. But her words hinted at something more than infidelity. They hinted at a dark secret she had been hiding for years. When Jake returned home, he knew the game had changed. Emily wasn't just a cheater. She was a manipulator capable of far more than he had imagined. But he also understood that from now on, every move she made had to be scrutinized. That same night, while checking Emily's email, he found a message from Nick. It contained only one sentence: "You'll do this, or I'll tell everything." Jake knew this wasn't over. His wife was prepared to fight, but now he had all the ammunition to strike first. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, gripping her phone tightly. Her thoughts were chaotic, but one thing was clear: waiting was no longer an option. Jake was too close to uncovering her secrets, and that meant she had to act immediately. She stared into the mirror for a long time, trying to convince herself she was still in control. But deep down, she knew it was a lie. Her face, which once radiated confidence, now looked tense, almost unrecognizable. Emily sighed and dialed a number. "Michael, it's me. We need to meet today. It's urgent." "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Michael asked, doubt evident in his voice. "I don't have a choice," she snapped. They met at an old motel on the outskirts of town, where no one would recognize them. Michael waited in the room, nervously drumming his fingers on the table. When the door opened, he looked up. Emily quickly closed the door behind her and started talking before he could get a word in. "Jake knows about us. Worse, he knows about Nick. It's only a matter of time before he exposes everything," she said. "What are you planning to do?" Michael asked, leaning forward. Emily looked at him, as if searching for confirmation of her thoughts. "We have to eliminate the threat," she said, her voice cold and resolute. "You're joking," Michael said, leaning back in disbelief. "I'm absolutely serious. If we don't, I'll lose everything. And not just me. You too, Michael." He hesitated. Michael had always been drawn to risk and adrenaline, but this plan seemed too dangerous. "You're talking about Jake?" he finally asked. "Yes. If we don't silence him, he'll destroy everything." Michael pondered her words. He knew Emily could be cunning and ruthless, but he hadn't thought she would go this far. Still, he also knew he had no choice. He was deeply entangled in this situation and understood that if Jake discovered the truth, it would ruin him too. Meanwhile, Jake had already begun taking action. He had gathered all the evidence he could: photos, recorded conversations, emails. He knew his next step was to piece everything together and confront Emily. But he hadn't accounted for the fact that his wife might strike first. That night, When Jake returned home, Emily greeted him with a smile. She was overly friendly, which immediately aroused Jake's suspicion. "How was your day?" she asked casually. "Fine," he replied curtly, trying not to show his irritation. She handed him a glass of wine. "Let's relax a bit. You look tired." Jake took the glass but didn't sip. He studied Emily closely, trying to decipher her intentions. "Are you hiding something, Emily?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "Why would you think that?" Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly. "Because you're not acting like yourself." Emily laughed, but the sound was forced. "Maybe you're the one who's changed, Jake. You've been so tense lately." He stayed silent. His gut told him this conversation was just a smokescreen for something bigger. When Jake went to bed, Emily finally exhaled. She knew she didn't have much time left. Later that night, she met with Michael again. Their plan was beginning to take shape. "We have to make him look guilty," she said. "We have recordings that can be fabricated. If we use them, Jake will be under suspicion." Michael nodded. He didn't like taking risks, but he had no other choice. Together, they created a dossier that made it appear as though Jake was involved in shady financial dealings. Everything looked convincing. Forged bank statements, fake emails, even several altered recordings of phone conversations. When everything was ready, Emily sent the files to an anonymous email address, ensuring they looked as if they had been discovered accidentally. Jake was to become the target, and she would play the victim who had uncovered his double life. The next morning, Jake received a call from his friend Logan. "I've got news. You need to see this for yourself," Logan said. Jake arrived an hour later. Logan showed him documents that had just surfaced online, the very files Emily had prepared. Jake was stunned. Everything was crafted to make it seem like he was at the center of a conspiracy. "This is fake," he exclaimed. "Maybe," Logan replied, "but it looks convincing. If someone uses this, you're going to have serious problems." Jake realized Emily had made her move. She was ahead of him, forcing him onto the defensive. But he knew this was just the beginning. That night, when he returned home, he planned to confront her. But as he entered the bedroom, Emily was gone. Her belongings were missing, and on the bed lay a note. "Don't look for me. It's dangerous for both of us." Nick sat across from her at his large oak desk. His sharp suit exuded authority, and his piercing gaze seemed to see right through Emily. "So, you finally showed up," Nick said, raising his glass of whiskey to his lips. "I thought you'd try to handle this yourself." "I don't have a choice," Emily replied coldly. "Jake is close. Too close." Nick smirked, though his smile carried more contempt than sympathy. "You've always been a talented manipulator. But, like everyone else, you overestimated yourself." Emily leaned forward, planting her palms on the desk. "I'm not here for a lecture. I need your help. And you stand to benefit from this too." Nick paused, studying her. He saw the same woman who had once deceived him and ruined his career. But now, she was vulnerable, and he relished it. "All right," he finally said. "What are you proposing?" Emily pulled a flash drive from her bag and placed it on the desk in front of Nick. "This contains all the recordings Jake has made. He's been watching me, recording our conversations, collecting evidence. If these files fall into the wrong hands, you know it'll destroy both of us." Nick picked up the flash drive, turning it over in his fingers. "And how does this involve me?" "We're in this together. If he exposes me, your name will come up too." "I need you to help me take him out of the game," Emily said, her voice firmer than she expected. Nick laughed, leaning back in his chair. "You're asking me to go up against your husband? You want me to save you from your own mess?" Emily nodded. "If you don't, the fallout will hit you just as hard as it hits me." Nick considered her words. Helping Emily was risky, but he also knew that if she failed, it could damage him as well. "Fine," he said, gripping the flash drive. "But we play by my rules." Meanwhile, Jake didn't stop gathering evidence. He knew Emily hadn't disappeared without a reason. Every move she made was part of a larger plan. But he also knew she would eventually seek help. "Logan, I need your help," Jake said over the phone. "Find out who's backing her. I'm sure she's gone to Gray." "On it," Logan replied. Jake compiled all the materials he had and decided it was time to go on the offensive. He knew Nick was cunning and dangerous, but he also understood that Nick wouldn't risk his own reputation. Nick executed the first step of their plan. He tampered with some of Jake's recordings to make them appear fabricated. This was meant to undermine Jake's credibility and distract attention from Emily. But instead of being grateful, Emily started demanding more. "This isn't enough," Emily said during their second meeting. "Jake can still find another way to get to the truth. I've done my part. The rest is your problem," Nick replied sharply. Emily clenched her fists. She knew Nick didn't trust her and could walk away from their arrangement at any moment. She needed a way to keep him under control. Meanwhile, Jake received new information from Logan. He discovered that Nick Gray was helping Emily. This unveiled a new layer to their relationship. Jake understood that their alliance was forced, built on mutual fear. This was his chance to break their partnership. He prepared copies of his recordings and sent one to Nick. The recording contained details that could ruin Nick's career if they fell into the wrong hands. "If you don't want this to go public, you'll help me," Jake wrote in the accompanying note. Nick received the message the next morning. His face went pale as he realized he was now caught between two fires. Jake had leverage over him, and Emily was still demanding more. During his next meeting with Emily, Nick finally snapped. "You're dragging me down," he said through gritted teeth. "Jake has dirt on me now. I'm not risking my reputation for you." Emily stepped closer, her eyes blazing with anger. "We don't have a choice. If you back out now, he'll destroy us both." "No, Emily," Nick replied, locking eyes with her. "He'll destroy you. I'll just walk away." She realized she had lost his support. Now, she had only one option left: act alone. Emily returned to her car and made one final call. "It's me. I have a job for you," she said, her voice cold and empty. That evening, Nick sat in his office when he heard a knock at the door. He looked up but didn't have time to respond. The door swung open, and a shadowy figure appeared. "Emily sends her regards," the stranger said. Emily nervously glanced out the taxi window as it sped toward the international airport. Her heart pounded so hard, she was sure the driver could hear it. She knew this was her last chance. Jake and Nick were too close, leaving her no room to breathe. She had to escape, leave her old life behind and start fresh. In her bag were a new passport, purchased through an underground network, a few $1,000s in cash, and a flash drive containing the last pieces of evidence that might be her ticket to freedom. She was determined to disappear for good. At the same time, Jake sat in his car, reviewing photos Logan had just sent him. The images showed Emily entering a small agency notorious for forging documents. "She's running," Jake muttered, gripping his phone tightly. "What's the plan?" Logan asked. "We're heading to the airport. She's not leaving the country." Meanwhile, Nick received his own message. One of his informants reported that Emily had booked a flight to Madrid. Nick stared at his phone for a long moment before making a decision. "The game's over, Emily," he said to himself, reaching for a gun on his shelf. Emily passed through check-in and sat in the departure lounge, clutching her bag tightly as if it could protect her from everything chasing her in life. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess. Could she really start over? Would she have the strength to leave everything behind? She thought of Nick and Jake, two men who had become her enemies through her own choices. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she realized that even thousands of miles away, she wouldn't be able to erase them from her memory. When boarding was announced, Emily took a deep breath and stood. Her body trembled, but she tried to maintain her composure. She was almost at the gate when she suddenly felt someone watching her. Turning her head, she saw a familiar face. "Jake." "Stop, Emily," he shouted, striding quickly toward her. Her heart froze. She turned and started running, weaving through the crowd. People stepped aside in surprise, but it didn't slow Jake down. He was closer than she thought. Emily realized there was no escape. Panicked, she turned toward the exit leading to the runway, where a car she had arranged was waiting. But as she rounded the corner, she was met with another surprise. "Nick? I knew you'd try this," he said, crossing his arms. His voice was calm, but anger burned in his eyes. Emily froze. She stood between two men, each with their own reasons to want to see her stopped. "Hand over the drive, Emily," Nick said, stepping forward. "Do you think I'm that naive?" She shot back. clutching her bag. This isn't a game. Give it to me, or things will get worse. Jake stepped between them. Nick, are you serious? We need to handle this smartly. Smartly? She tried to take us both down. Do you really think she'll just leave us alone? Nick's voice was sharp, his focus entirely on Emily. Taking advantage of their argument, Emily began to back away. She knew her next move would be critical. One mistake could ruin everything. Stop, she yelled, raising her hands. You're both so focused on me that you don't see you're working against each other. Quiet, Emily, Nick snapped. I'll decide how this ends. At that moment, a door at the far end of the room opened, and several security guards entered, drawn by the commotion. Everyone on the ground, one shouted. Emily used the chaos to slip away. Her thoughts were no longer on the consequences. Her only goal was escape. Jake and Nick weren't far behind. They were no longer arguing, but instead united in their determination to catch her. As Emily ran onto the tarmac, the cold wind stung her face. The car was only a few meters away, but the sound of footsteps behind her grew louder. Every second mattered. Emily sprinted, adrenaline surging through her veins. Her shoes were long gone, and her bag bounced heavily against her side. The driver had the car door open, and without stopping, she dove inside. "Drive!" she shouted, gasping for breath. The car sped off, and Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment, trying to compose herself. When she looked back, she saw two figures chasing the car, Jake and Nick. They were gaining ground, and she knew they wouldn't stop. "Are you going to do something, or just watch her get away?" Nick barked as they reached their vehicles. "She has to answer for everything," Jake replied, sliding into his car. "And maybe you do too." "We don't have time for this," Nick shot back. "If we're going to stop her, we'll need to work together." Jake hesitated for a moment, then nodded. For now, they shared a common goal. Both cars sped off after Emily, their headlights cutting through the dark. The chase was intense, with each driver pushing their limits. Emily instructed her driver to take a deserted road with no cameras or witnesses. "Why are we going this way?" the driver asked. "Just do what I say," Emily snapped. Minutes later, she realized her pursuers were closing in. Jake and Nick's vehicles were faster, and finally, her driver had no choice but to stop when the road ahead was blocked. Emily jumped out, scanning for a place to hide, but before she could react, Nick stepped in front of her. "It's over, Emily," he said, moving toward her. "Nick, please, let me go." "I won't say anything," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "You've always been a liar," he said, his tone resolute. At that moment, Jake stepped out of his car, holding up his phone. "Looks like you're trying to silence her, Nick. But what if we find out why?" he said, closing the distance between them. "This isn't your business, Jake," Nick said, not lowering the gun. "She dragged us both into this mess." "But it seems you know more than I do," Jake replied, pausing to study Nick. "What did she do?" Nick sighed, hesitation flashing across his face as he lowered the gun slightly. "It's bigger than you think. She didn't just betray you. She betrayed everyone she worked with," he said, his gaze locked on Jake. "What do you mean?" Jake asked. Nick glanced at Emily, who now stood clutching her bag tightly to her chest. "She worked with people who would do anything for money, destroy reputations, businesses, lives. I was one of them," he said, bitterness thick in his voice. "And now she's running from her past, leaving destruction in her wake." "That's not true," Emily shouted, stepping forward. "You're lying, Nick. You just want to protect yourself." "Protect myself?" Nick laughed darkly. "I have nothing left to protect. Everything I lost, because of you. Now it's time to settle the score." Jake's gaze shifted between Nick and Emily. He didn't know whom to believe. Her tears could be genuine or just another ploy. But one thing was clear. This story was far more complicated than he had imagined. "Why should I trust you?" Jake asked Nick. "Because I know her better than you do. She'll do whatever it takes to escape. Anything." At that moment, Emily pulled something from her bag, a second flash drive, held like a trump card. "If you want the truth, here it is," she said, holding it out. "What's on it?" Jake asked, trying to decipher her intentions. "All the answers you've been looking for." but I'll only give it to you. Not him, she said, nodding toward Nick. You think I'll trust you with this? Jake frowned. You don't have a choice, she replied, taking a step back. Nick suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Emily's arm and knocking the flash drive to the ground. It clattered to the pavement, and Nick turned the gun toward Jake. Now it's a race to see who takes her down first, Nick said. Scooping up the drive, Nick held it tightly in his hand and turned back to Emily. His eyes burned with fury, and a cruel smile spread across his face. Now it's all in my hands, he said, stepping back. You don't understand, Nick, Emily said, her voice shaking. It's a trap. Give it back to me, and I'll save you. Save me? Nick laughed harshly. From what? You? Jake watched the confrontation with cold curiosity. He knew both Nick and Emily were playing their own games, but he also realized there was something more on the drive, something that could change everything. Let's see what's on it, Nick said, retrieving a laptop from his car. Nick, don't, Emily shouted, stepping forward. But Jake grabbed her arm, stopping her. Let him. Let's see what you're so afraid of, Jake said, tightening his grip on her wrist. Nick inserted the drive into the laptop. The screen lit up, and files began to load. He scrolled through documents, photos, and videos, his confidence fading with every second. What is this? Nick began, but his voice trailed off. On the screen were incriminating details about Nick himself, evidence Emily had collected during their time working together. Money laundering schemes, illegal deals, shell companies, all meticulously documented. You knew about this the whole time? Nick whispered, turning slowly to Emily. You thought you could use me? She replied, her voice steady now. I've always been several steps ahead of you, Nick. Jake, watching the exchange, began to realize Emily wasn't just a manipulator. She was a master strategist, operating on a level he couldn't comprehend. This is all lies, Nick said, but his voice trembled. No one will believe it. Care to test that theory? Emily asked, tilting her head. I can send it to the right people in minutes. Are you willing to take that risk? Nick was cornered. His confidence vanished, and for the first time in a long while, he looked genuinely afraid. He abruptly yanked the flash drive out and threw it to the ground. All right, he said, trying to maintain a shred of composure. What do you want? Leave me alone. You know what I can do if you come after me, Emily replied firmly. Nick stood motionless for a few moments before getting into his car and speeding away, leaving her and Jake standing in the middle of the road. You planned this from the start, Jake said, slowly turning to face Emily. I had no choice, she replied. You don't understand what I was dealing with. Nick isn't just my enemy. He's part of a past I've been trying to bury. And that justifies everything you've done? Jake asked, his fists clenching. Emily looked him straight in the eye. Maybe not, but sometimes survival means making radical choices. Jake stayed silent, unable to decide his next move. Then something caught his attention, a flash drive still lying on the ground. He picked it up and slipped it into his pocket before Emily could say anything. This isn't over, Emily, he said. You still haven't told me the whole truth. She sighed but didn't respond. When Jake returned home, he powered up his computer and began examining the contents of the flash drive. But instead of the answers he expected, he found something entirely different. Evidence that could destroy him. His heart sank as he realized Emily had anticipated everything. She knew he would take the drive, and now he had answers he wished he hadn't found. Emily sat in the dim light of a cheap motel room, glancing at her silent phone. It had been hours since she'd heard anything. She knew Nick wouldn't back down easily. He was too stubborn, too vengeful to let this go. And Jake was getting too close to the truth. She pulled out another flash drive, her final card. It was her only guarantee of survival, but also a trap. She froze at the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The door creaked open. It was Jake. Still playing your games? He asked, stepping inside. I don't have a choice, Jake. In this world, you survive by making the first move. And yet here you are, trapped, Jake said, tossing another flash drive onto the table. I found this in my car. Your final gift? Emily lowered her eyes. It wasn't supposed to be this way, she said. But it is, Jake replied. And now we have a new problem, Nick. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of shattering glass. A smoke canister rolled into the room. Jake and Emily dropped to the floor, trying to shield themselves from the choking fumes. Nick appeared in the doorway, flanked by armed men. "Did you think this was over?" he asked, slipping a gun into his jacket. "This is just the beginning." "Nick, you've lost your mind," Emily shouted, searching for a way out. "You both betrayed me. Now it's time to settle the score." Jake quickly assessed the situation. He knew their only chance was to work together. He and Emily exchanged a brief glance, enough to form a plan. Jake lunged at one of Nick's men, disarming him. Emily grabbed a nearby chair and knocked another attacker unconscious. Chaos erupted, but Jake and Emily moved in sync, as if they were a team again. When the dust settled, Nick stood in the corner, holding a gun. "You've lost, Nick," Jake said, stepping toward him. "You think this is the end?" Nick hissed. "I still have cards to play." "Maybe," Emily said, walking toward him. "But you've always forgotten one thing. Sometimes the smartest move is to retreat." Nick hesitated, his plans unraveling before him. Finally, he lowered the gun. A few days later, Emily sat at a seaside cafe. Jake approached her table. "Is it over?" he asked. "Almost," she replied with a slight smile. "Nick's behind bars. I used the leverage to silence him for good. And now? What's next?" "Now, I start fresh. What about you?" Jake paused, then nodded. "Maybe I will too. But next time, I'll be more careful about who I trust." They exchanged a brief glance. Their paths were diverging, but both knew this story had changed them forever. What do you think was each of their biggest mistakes, and could they have avoided them?